So you found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there, YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. I'm back with the final episode of this series about continuous environmental tracking. When last we left off, Randy was telling us about how cavefish are great examples of continuous environmental tracking, which is essentially the idea that organisms sense the environment and induce changes in their own bodies, primarily through epigenetics and phenotypic plasticity. But importantly, because we know adaptation is genetic, and those are not genetic mechanisms, they must also include targeted adaptive mutations. Oddly, the big example Randy has used so far was cavefish, which actually show that these induced mutations do not seem to exist, and that organisms cannot change their genetic code in response to environmental changes. He's now got more example organisms that we'll take a look at in our final chapter in this series. So, here's Randy.
Everybody can see the beetle on the left, and you can see this ant on the right, but that isn't an ant. This is a Rove beetle.
Yep, Rove beetles are members of family Staphylinidae, a beetle family that is most easily identified by their extremely short wing covers, that usually leave over half of the abdominal segments uncovered. The paper Randy is using here, which is linked in the description, is a really interesting study about convergent evolution in various Rove beetles that evolved an ant-mimicking lifestyle at least 12 separate times.
And it lives in an environment with army ants, and army ants usually would attack this, but incredibly, this beetle, when it detects it's in the presence of these army ants, can actually change its shape to look like an army ant.
See now, that's just a lie. These beetles contain 37 ant-mimicking beetle species, and these species are each tied to a particular army ant species that they mimic. There are no species that only sometimes mimic ants, or that can change which ant they mimic. Absolutely nothing in this paper says that individual beetles can even sense what ants they're around, never mind change their anatomy to mimic whatever ants they happen to detect. In fact, that's not even how insects work. Once they molt the final time, that's it, and that final molt is the molt to become an adult. Once that happens, the morphology of an insect isn't going to change short of injury. What this is actually reporting is the convergent evolution of ant mimicry across deep time, more time than Randy even thinks has existed.
So here's an army ant, here's the beetle, the coloration is the same, the behavior is the same, they even smell the same.
Well, the behavior isn't quite the same. The beetles are basically colony parasites, and so they do not tend to engage in all the same behaviors as the ants, and some of them even ride the ants. But many species do have glands that produce pheromones that allow them to integrate with the chemical communication system of the army ants they live with.
In fact, the army ants, rather than eating this beetle, welcome it into its hive. It takes care of its brood, but not in a such beneficial way for the ants, because it's like 2 for you, but 1 for me.
That's true.
And it lives inside there because it can morph into looking like the army ants.
No, it can't. Beetles of an ant-mimicking species will always mimic that species as an adult and cannot become non-ant-mimicking beetles, nor can they start to mimic another species of ants. What Randy showed on screen was not 9 morphs of the same species of beetle that they can swap between. It was 9 species spread across at least 8 genera. I cannot overemphasize the fact that Randy is just lying about this. There is no way he could have possibly read this paper and come to this conclusion. Either he didn't read it and is lying about having done so by citing it, or he read it and is now just lying about what it says. The other option, of course, is that he is profoundly stupid in a way that makes it hard for me to believe that he can even talk.
In fact, it has been documented that it can morph into the shape of at least 9 different types of army ants.
There's no it. This is a study looking at an entire family of beetles. The study looked at almost 180 different species, of which 37 are ant mimics, and none of those species are morphs of other species, because these species were recognized genetically, not morphologically. Just in using singular pronouns, Randy is lying to you.
Along the way. And the researchers, you'll find this interesting.
Am I going to find it interesting how Randy will misrepresent what the authors say?
They write in this paper that they propose that the beetles were, quote, poised to look like ants, myrmecophily, and this ant-like adaptation. And they add that this near clade-wide pre-adaptive ground plan may underlie the repeated ant mimicry.
Let's read that paragraph. What circumstances permitted this deep time convergent system to arise? we deduce that historical selection pressure imposed by different army ant genera on separate Aleocarine lineages were likely similar, so too were the adaptive responses of the beetles as they evolved with their hosts. This inherency in the outcome of selection begs the question of why mimicroid syndrome has evolved repeatedly in Aleocarine in particular, as opposed to all other groups of beetles, including 31 other staphylinid subfamilies numbering some 45,000 species, most of which have generalized staphylinid morphology similar to Aleocarines. We previously argued that Aleocarines' predatory habits, small body size, and major defensive capacity in the form of dorsal abdominal tergal gland constitute a ground plan unique among Coleoptera. This suite of characteristics predisposes Aleocarines to successful entry and exploitation of ant colonies, providing the basis for why mimicrophilia has evolved numerous times, including repeated associations with army ants. While many army ants associates are morphologically generalized, example multiple APL clade genera such as Tetradonia, such species tend not to be socially accepted in nests. We propose that to gain the selective advantage of unlocking colony resources via social integration, many ancestrally generalized taxa experience intense selection to conform to mimicroid shape, enabling the beetles to pass tactile assessment by workers. Mimicroid Aleocarines are associated only with army ants and some other group foraging hosts that may employ such tactile cues to orchestrate collective behavior. If the narrow niche of social acceptance in such colonies demands an ant-like form, then the generalized Aleocarine anatomy, comprising short elytra and exposed flexible abdomen, is conducive to such developmental remodeling. Consequently, Aleocarines are evolutionarily poised for mimicrophilia as well as becoming mimicoid as a major socially parasitic strategy when specializing on army ants. This near clade-wide pre-adaptive ground plan may underlie the repeated evolution of mimicoid syndrome and Aleocarinae. So this has nothing to do with beetles smelling which ants are around and morphing their adult body to fit. It's about an already very generalized group of insects with similar anatomies that could all easily evolve into ant mimics across deep time. Nowhere is there anything about the beetles sensing which ants are around or changing their adult morphologies within a lifetime.
Now, Ray, when was evolution ever supposed to have a pre-adaptive ground plan?
Very often. Maniraptorans used an arm motion that was originally for prey capture and restraint that was pre-adapted to flight to form the avian wing stroke. Humans evolved from already facultatively bipedal primates, meaning that they were pre-adapted to moving bipedally. The swim bladder of teleost fish evolved from lungs, which were already modifying buoyancy, and so were pre-adapted to be swim bladders. I could go on, but basically more or less every time something evolves, it was based on something that was already in some sense pre-adapted to become what it became.
Yeah, it looks like they're borrowing a terminology from creationists and...
Really? I've never seen creationists using these terms, until Randy, and I promise you, this paper wasn't referencing Randy. Here's the thing I need creationists to understand. Science doesn't give a shit about you. You don't matter to science. You matter as much to biology research as flat earthers matter to NASA. You are completely irrelevant to anything going on in real science journals. No one cares about your silly little word games. No one is copying you. No one is trying to prove evolution any more than NASA is trying to prove the globe Earth or hide the flat Earth. Scientific research isn't done in opposition to creationism. It's just done. Now, sure, there are scientists, like some of the members of the Science Friends, such as Gutsick Gibbon, Dr. Dan, Dr. Zach B. Hancock, Dr. Joel Duff, and Science Side Up, who like to debunk creationism. But for them, it's a fun hobby, not a part of their actual research, and they are the exception, not the rule.
The idea that there is a design, there is intelligence, there is something in the creature already.
None of which is even hinted at in this paper. This guy is just hallucinating things that not even Randy said were there, and I'll bet Randy gives no pushback on that, even though he knows that not even he said that the paper imputed intelligence to the adaptive forces that made these dozens of mimicroid beetles what they are.
But really, their theory doesn't allow for that.
No, it doesn't allow for that.
I guess then it's good that the paper didn't say anything about any of that then. So this example from Randy, now that he's going on, was a paper that directly disconfirms his idea about morphing beetles that he lied about. He didn't even suggest a mechanism for any of this. He just implies that beetles can use phenotypic plasticity to look like ants, which isn't actually true, and even if it were, it wouldn't really help poke any holes in the theory of evolution.
Here's another cool creature. It's called a stick spider.
It is indeed pretty cool, as spiders generally are. This paper is also linked in the description.
And what we're looking at is one morphology. It's a gold morphology, and this spider lives on leaves, but there's another one that's kind of brown that lives on tree trunks, and a white one that lives on lichens.
So far, Randy is correct. Now, what are the odds that he incorrectly concludes that all adult spiders will change their color based on where they find themselves living? I'm going to guess that it's pretty high.
And what these researchers found was that when one of these spiders moves to another island in the Hawaiian chains, that it can actually morph or change into the brown form or the white form.
Gold form gets no love.
I am the Lord of all that is golden.
Before the brown ones and the white ones from this current island actually get to the new island.
Yep, he is once again incorrectly pretending that this is something individual spiders are doing, but it's not. These spiders are not morphing as adults as a result of seeing the color of their environment. They're adapting via actual genetic changes to a fitness landscape with very few peaks that have steep sides. And the environments from island to island all have about the same peaks, so they tend to favor only a very narrow range of morphologies for stick spiders. In fact, the paper itself talks about the fact that this kind of strong convergence is extremely rare and tends only to happen on islands, where the fitness landscape from one island to the next tends to be very similar, and where there are few fitness peaks or possible morphologies that are favored by natural selection. Nothing in this paper allows for a new mechanism of adaptation or even hints at it. Randy isn't blatantly lying yet, at least not as much as with the beetles, except about it being about individual spiders, when that's absolutely not the case. But it seems like, again, he either didn't read this paper or did and just decided to pretend that it supports him, when it does no such thing.
Wow, so all of the ability to do that was already in that spider. It didn't need to randomly develop this over generations of time as the ones that couldn't do it died out and the other ones did. It was already there.
That is literally the opposite of what the paper says. Let's see what the paper actually says about how this occurred. Support at the base of the Hawaiian radiation between the lineages of Kauai and Oahu is weak, likely consistent with the existence of both islands when the lineage initially colonized. Thus, while the phylogeny suggests that the lineage may have colonized the oldest island, Kauai, first, then hopped onto the second island in the chain in the direction of the younger islands, colonization of Oahu likely occurred very shortly after the lineage arrived. Estimates of the timing of divergence using a standard molecular clock for arthropods support this scenario, with the Ariamnes spider colonizing the Hawaiian archipelago approximately 1.7 million years ago, 95% confidence, limit 0.77 to 3.8 million years ago. Considerably more recently than the formation of the oldest island, Kauai, at 5 million years ago, and when both Kauai and Oahu were large islands, while the Maui-Nui complex had not appeared. Diversification on the younger islands, Maui and Hawaii, seems to have occurred shortly after each of these islands appeared. Gee, sounds like they did find evidence of them evolving over generations through time. And the fact that the ecomorphs do not form single clades of the same ecomorph means that they did develop based on stochastic mutations. But of course Randy will just pretend that Ray is right about that, even though he knows that it's not true if he read the paper.
All right. And I love how you're highlighting how really foolish that whole thinking is, that you're going to get these random genetic mutations, and that some of them are just going to fortuitously solve problems, and then nature in some personified form is going to select for some or select against another or favor some or favor them not. You see, that's almost a magical, whimsical explanation where...
Yes, Randy Strawman is indeed whimsical or magical. That's why no one actually thinks that nature is a person making choices. That's just all in his head.
Where nature has given this a power and ability to somehow work and craft creatures. Totally wrong. As you've already summarized, these creatures have this ability up front, and they're able to rapidly adjust to these different conditions.
Too bad Randy's source didn't say that.
In fact, this is what these researchers say. We usually don't expect evolution to be predictable. Actually, what they're talking about is adaptation.
Adaptation is an aspect of evolution. Saying it's like something that contrasts with evolution makes no sense. It's like saying to your auto mechanic that he's just talking about transmission fluid, not your car, while he's trying to fix your transmission. It makes no sense.
But we don't expect it to be predictable. It's supposed to be what? Random.
I'm so tired of pointing out that evolution has random and predictable aspects. Also, you notice how Randy ignores the fact that the quote is, "We don't usually expect evolution to be predictable"? Yeah, that's because sometimes it is, and the actual paper gives the conditions that allow the evolution of these spiders to be so predictable. And further, in the future, he's going to use at least 2 more examples of island-based convergence to argue for this, when in fact, the point of all those papers is that the islands are part of the reason that the convergence is so predictable.
But Hawaiian stick spiders of the Ariamnes genus have repeatedly evolved. Actually, they've repeatedly adapted.
Because they are genetically distinct, it means that the allele frequencies have changed in the various Ariamnes species since they shared a common ancestor, meaning that they have indeed evolved, because that's definitionally what evolution is.
The same distinctive forms known as ecomorphs on different islands. They do it the same over and over again. So when you see that,
You have to lie about it, apparently.
you should be looking inside for some kind of design condition.
Here's the thing, I'm happy for Randy to actually do that, but the paper he's referencing gives no evidence of any such thing. If the repeated evolution of these ecomorphs makes Randy think that these stick spiders would be a good place to find evidence for his brain charts, then he'll need to do his own studies. He claims that the ICR is in fact doing their own studies, so maybe he's already on it, but so far, no evidence that could possibly make us suspect anything like his vague gesturing at engineering is possible has been produced.
They add this, you'll find this interesting, the spiders, quote, arrive on an island and boom, you get independent evolution to the same set of forms, this sort of rapid and repeated evolution.
Remember, though, that for these authors, the word rapid means 1,700,000 years. It doesn't mean over the course of a few weeks or years. These spiders took over 12 millennia to evolve. Granted, each radiation took more like a few 100,000 years to complete, based on Figure 3, which is rapid in terms of evolution, but it is absolutely not compatible with young Earth creationism. Maybe Randy can also do some work on a creationist molecular clock. Good luck to him, but until then, the use of the word rapid means nothing that could possibly help him.
Ray, when was evolution ever supposed to go boom?
Yeah.
You may be surprised to learn, but boom is not a technical term. That's why it's not in the paper, it's in the PopSci article. You can't get science from PopSci articles. You actually have to look at the research.
You know, it's they're trying to be creative and clever. And on the one hand, we can be thankful that they're accurately stating what's happening.
Yes, we should be grateful that the scientists are actually reporting what's happening. But then, Randy is just lying about it. So what Ray is getting is not the accurate statements of the scientists. It's Randy's cherry-picked quotations and lies. Now, I don't know if Ray is equipped to read this paper and understand any of it. I don't think it's a particularly long or complex paper. But then, I am not exactly some random Joe off the street when it comes to biology papers, whereas Ray probably is. But if Ray or anyone else wants to know what's going on in the paper, I would suggest not taking Randy's word for it. He is either extremely and offensively intentionally ignorant, or he's a liar. He has too many real degrees for me to say that he's just stupid. Clearly, Randy could learn and tell the truth if he wanted to. He chooses not to.
In the sense of, sure, this is happening quick, but then they want to plug in their evolution and say, wow, this is so unusual.
Evolution isn't something that was plugged into the data after the fact. The only reason they were able to recognize the rapid and repeated evolution of these ecomorphs is because of their use of the evolutionary techniques to recover phylogeny for these spiders. Without evolution, we wouldn't even know that these spiders had adapted repeatedly. We'd probably just think that each ecomorph forms its own natural group of spiders that descended from an ancestor of that ecotype. But it turns out that's not what happened, and we only know that because of the applications of the theory of evolution. It's like when a flat earther tries to debunk gravity by pointing out inconsistencies in the gravitational field of galaxies millions of light years away. Measurements that only make sense if the universe is largely as we know it to be, rather than plastered on the inside of a crystal dome over a pizza planet. Ray doesn't know enough about evolution to realize that the very thing he thinks is a blow to evolution only came to him because evolution is true in the first place.
And actually, it's because that's not what you're seeing. Well, you know, they're so close. If we could just get them to say, wow, this creature already has this. That's why it's repeatable. That's why it always happens. It's in the creature.
It would only be nice if they said that if they actually had evidence of that. But nothing in the paper provides such evidence. They didn't find a pluripotent group of spiders who could anamorph themselves into a new ecotype by relying on built-in color-changing abilities. The spiders, like all spiders, can't change their adult color during their life. The color relies on pigments that can't just change because they move to a new place. Randy is just making up these alleged built-in engineering systems.
It is in the creature, and that's why they go boom.
Boom.
That's why they go boom.
Abracadabra.
That's well, yeah. And
No, they do that because it makes for a catchy quotation for a PopSci article. That's it. There's nothing deeper than that. Some scientist talking off the cuff in an informal setting to a non-expert use the word boom. It doesn't really mean anything. There's no conclusion that can be drawn from this, except that the scientists wanted to impress on the readers of the article that this kind of evolution is uncommon and rapid compared to what we usually observe. But notice that just by him noting the rarity of this type of repeated convergent evolution, it means that this kind of evolution is not the norm. But if Randy is right, it should be the norm. His claim is that it's the norm. So why do we not have similar papers about a wide variety of organisms? Maybe Randy will write them, but I suspect that the reason we don't have many more papers about repeated convergent evolution is precisely because it almost never occurs.
From their perspective, it is almost abracadabra because you're hoping for beneficial mutations and they're hoping that they solve a problem and they're hoping that they get favored by nature.
But adaptive mutations are observed routinely. Remember back to the Luria-Delbruck experiment. Humans have managed to induce natural selection and observe stochastic mutations providing a selected advantage in the lab. There is no hope needed. Beneficial mutations are simply a fact of science. They're an observed phenomenon. Beneficial mutations are a part of science for the same reason that things like lava and hurricanes are. They're just things we can see in nature. We don't have to wonder about these things.
You know, a much more rational and reasonable approach is to assume that these creatures have this ability, it's inside of them, and let's take our research time and start digging in the creature and looking for these highly regulated systems.
I mean, it's way less rational, but I like the ambition here. I in no way want Randy to give up looking. I just want him to stop lying about science as an excuse to do so. But ultimately, this fringe pseudo-idea is his to test. No scientists are going to do it for him because there's no reason to even suspect he's right. Until his results come out, though, all I can go on is the science that is actually being done already and has been published on. So far, even his favorite examples have provided no evidence that he's right, and in fact have provided evidence that falsifies him. Inasmuch as something as incoherent as continuous environmental tracking can be falsified.
You know, that's an important point. It's not just that, okay, they're wrong in the way they're describing it. Science could do so much more.
Actually, I am with Ray here. If Randy could actually provide a better model for adaptation than what we currently have, it would indeed allow scientists to do much more and learn much more. That's why I'm extremely skeptical. I hope Randy is actually telling the truth that he's doing new research. Maybe he'll break the creationist mold and actually teach us a thing or two, opening up new avenues for scientific inquiry. I'm not going to hold my breath, though.
If it actually began with the way things really are and then advanced from there rather than trying to just manufacture evolution into these changes.
No one needs to manufacture evolution. It observably occurs. And these data that Ray thinks help Randy were only able to be compiled thanks to the techniques of evolutionary biology. Ray fundamentally has no idea what he's talking about, and Randy is purposefully keeping it that way by lying about the papers he's referencing. It's honestly disgusting. And while I have no love lost for Ray, this is giving me a deeper appreciation for just how vile Randy is. He preys on the ignorance of others in order to take in donation money, mostly from regular folk, who think they're helping science and the general population by donating to ICR.
We're sort of stunting the progress that we could have.
Well, no. Randy is the one who's trying to stunt progress. He himself said he wanted to take science back to the middle of the 19th century on this very show. That's stunting science. Ray is just engaging in some projection, and very obvious projection at that.
Exactly. We are stunting the progress, and we're not doing the research that we should.
But no one is stopping creationists from doing research. No one really could. Sure, they generally don't have access to research funds reserved for actual science, but you can't tell me that the guys who got together like $100 million+ to build a boat-shaped theme park in Kentucky couldn't get together a few $100,000 to test continuous environmental tracking. Creationists have a very generous pool of donors. They could get together sedimentation experiments, paleontology fieldwork, lab-based evolution experiments, geology expeditions, etc. But by and large, they don't. Creationist output in terms of research is absolutely pathetic, and it's because at a fundamental level, creationists just don't care about science. They actively oppose the very idea of science. And so far from wanting to do actual research, that will just show that they're wrong anyway, they want to spend that money on pulling the wool over the eyes of their victims, the people in the pews.
In fact, they even asked this question. We can ask whether there might be an underlying mechanism that leads to similar patterns of predictably repeated evolution in the course of adaptive radiation.
Yeah, but the mechanism is going to be a closely related set of founder populations and natural selection acting on the same basic founder population in multiple areas.
Of course we should be asking that. We should be looking for these underlying mechanisms on all of them.
It would be wonderful if Randy even tried to pretend to have an idea what any of these mechanisms are that violate the theory of evolution.
And then they add that the Aramnis spiders have some sort of pre-programmed switch in their DNA that can be quickly turned on to allow them to evolve rapidly. How about adapt? Or better yet, self-adjust rapidly.
How about evolve, because it's evolution? The fact that Randy doesn't like that doesn't change that.
Into these successful forms, but how that process might work is still unclear.
Right after this, the article tells us why it's unclear. It hasn't really been studied because ecomorphs aren't common. Most radiations just don't do this, she says. Typical adaptive radiation, like with Darwin's finches, usually produces a wide diversity of forms, and convergent evolution, where two different species independently evolve the same strategy for fulfilling a certain niche, doesn't usually happen repeatedly. See, that brings up a problem. If Randy is right and these spiders are representative of how adaptation works in organisms broadly, then this kind of thing should be the norm. Instead, it's an extreme outlier. That fact alone should make us pause and consider that any explanation given for this extremely constrained and repeated version of convergent evolution cannot be widely applicable to all organisms, because it simply does not occur in most organisms. It doesn't even occur in most island organisms. Once again, we have creationists ignoring the vast majority of the data in order to focus on the outliers that might, if you squint hard enough, make their ideas plausible. This is fundamentally dishonest.
Let me give them a suggestion. Let's start looking at these creatures for sensors that are specific for these changes. Let's start looking in them for the logic which can throw these pre-programmed switches on their DNA, and let's start looking for specific responses.
Here I can say that I support this. Randy should look for such things, and importantly, he should actually articulate what he expects to see that is not what an evolutionary biologist should expect, and why. But here's the other thing. Randy has been going on about this since at least 2006. That's some 18 years ago. I'll give him some leeway and say that really he could only have been running tests for 15 years. That's enough time for more than 450 generations of fruit flies and 15 to 30 generations of Mexican cave tetras. So far, all he has to show for this is the fact that tetras can get a tan. There is no model. There are no predictions. There is nothing.
Let's treat these creatures as if they were really engineered, and that's a great way of approaching change.
And yet Randy has been doing that for nearly 2 decades and has nothing to show for it. Apparently, this is not an area of fruitful research. I guess it makes sense why Randy can't even get the other pseudoscientists from other creationist groups on board.
Dr. Galuza, that loaded word, pre-programmed. Something isn't programmed without a programmer.
There's a cool web applet called The Life Engine. It starts with a simple genetic mutation and reproduction code, as well as a code for metabolism, reproduction, and food production. It then starts off with a simple 3-cell autotroph, and then goes on to evolve scavengers, predators, herbivore analogs, and all sorts of cool stuff. You can even watch extinction events and all sorts of stuff. None of it is pre-programmed aside from the basics of the world in which these simulated organisms evolve. Complexity and lifelike interactions don't need to be pre-programmed. They just need an environment analogous to what we see in the real world. Complexity arises out of selection and mutation in real time in evolution simulations. Evolution by natural selection really is mathematically inevitable. Randy is just wrong the way Terrence Howard is wrong when he insists that 1 times 1 equals 2.
They're seeing it, they have to say it, and at the same time they have to try to explain it away by talking about evolving rapidly.
In other words, they see evolution and have to explain evolution via evolutionary theory. Yeah, that is true, I guess.
Randy, we went to the break talking about spiders, and using the words of the evolutionists, they seem to have a pre-programmed switch. What does that mean? What does that lead us to?
Well, I honestly don't like the way they put it, and I suspect that when the scientists said that, they were using their bias. The paper itself doesn't seem to require any such mechanism at all, at least not when I read it, but then I'm not an arachnologist or an evolutionary biologist, so maybe I missed something or misunderstood something. But what it leads us to remains to be seen, because no matter what the explanation is, it's exceptional and perhaps unique, so no matter what, it doesn't lead us to a new broad explanation for all adaptation and diversity in life.
Well, one thing it says is probably not random at all.
Yeah, adaptation is generally not random. Earlier I showed a genetic algorithm that flew simple rockets to hit a target in 2D. The code controlling the rockets was random, but then acted on by natural selection in the form of a fitness function. Eventually the rockets started hitting the target. That happens pretty much every time you run the simulation. That the rockets hit the target is not random, it's very predictable. Exactly how many generations it takes and exactly how they do it is random, because the initial code and subsequent mutations to it are random. But that's the thing, random events with non-random selection can get you predictable results. Here's a very little example. As I'm writing this, I have grabbed 9 6-sided dice. If I roll them, how long will I have to roll them on average to get all 6s? It's over 10 million. But what if I can keep 6s and reroll everything else? Let's just do it. The first time around I got lucky and got 3 6s. On the second roll I got one more 6 for a total of 4. The third roll got me another 6 for a total of 5. The fourth through 6th rolls had no 6s, but then the 7th roll had 1, bringing me to 6 6s. The 8th and 9th roll also gave me nothing, but then the 10th roll gave me another 6, bringing us to 7 6s. The 11th and 12th rolls got me nothing, but lucky 13 got me my 8th 6. Finally, on my 16th roll, I got my final 6. That's a whole lot fewer generations than 10 million. Now look, my little example here is vastly simplified. But the point remains, non-random selection acting on randomly generated variation can result in predictable outcomes. Now, the predictability does decline as the complexity of the system and selection criteria increase, but fundamentally, the math doesn't change. Natural selection isn't a theory, it's more like a theorem. It's a mathematical certainty if certain conditions are met.
And that the organisms have these solutions to the problems, in other words, to fit in the different tree environments that they're living in.
Only one of the stick spider ecomorphs is associated with arboreality.
And therefore we should be looking at creatures in themselves for these kind of mechanisms which enable them to rapidly adapt.
Cool, but it's been nearly 2 decades. Where's the mechanism we were promised?
Nowhere!
So if we can switch gears a little bit from spiders over to mice.
Sure, why not? Speaking of why not take a second to hit like on this video and maybe subscribe and turn on all notifications so you'll never miss one of my videos.
What we're looking at here is a gal named Hopi Hoekstra. She's a professor at Harvard University, and she's one of the leading researchers of mice. And she's made an interesting discovery. She found that mice that live in the prairies have short tails, but when they travel and they start to live in forests, they end up with longer tails.
Once again, Randy is phrasing this as if what's going on is that the individual mice move into forests and grow longer tails. But that's specifically not what's happening. The long-tailed mice actually have more tail or caudal vertebrae than the short-tailed prairie mice. That's not something that's going to happen to an adult mouse. Adult vertebrates don't just grow extra vertebrae because they moved house. Already, we're off to a bad start in the sense that it seems that Randy is already lying about his source.
And I've never even seen a mouse living in trees or living in the forest with a longer tail.
Lucky for all of us that science isn't based on the personal life experience of one old white guy who lies to his co-religionists for a living.
But she's discovered this, and she found that when they go from the Midwest to either forests on the East Coast or the West Coast, that they actually have a longer tail. And I just put the picture up there on the screen so that people can see that. You see West and East and prairie and forest. Sure enough, the mice that are living in the forest have these longer tails.
Yep, he's right about that.
And they conclude, and I tried to summarize what they're saying here in a shorter quote for them, that from a short-tailed prairie-dwelling ancestor. Now that's a tongue twister.
Short-tailed prairie-dwelling ancestor is a tongue twister? Let's hope that Randy never has to learn about Mary Anning, because she sells seashells by the seashore.
For geographically distant populations that arose across North America, longer tails have, here it goes again, evolved repeatedly in similar forested habitat. But we would say they've adapted. They've self-adjusted repeatedly to these similar forested habitats, and this is what's important.
Hey, there's something that's important that the paper notes, that the forest mice from western and eastern North America have differences in both tail length and vertebrae count, with western forest mice having longer tails with more vertebrae. So if these mice are responding predictably and mechanistically to the same environment, why aren't they adapting the same way? It's almost like this paper doesn't actually do much to help Randy's case.
Variation in these traits is controlled by separate genetic loci. That means different genes.
Yes, the tail length and the tail vertebral count are indeed controlled by different genes, and this was tested by hybridizing a captive prairie mouse population and a newly caught forest mouse population, and then examining both F1 and F2 hybrids, and noting that F2 hybrid tail length and vertebral length were not tightly correlated as they were in the original F0 populations or the F1 populations. I'm not sure what significance Randy sees to this.
Suggesting that this is not a random process, but implicating similar mechanisms of tail elongation in eastern-western populations.
Here's a fun thing. That Franken quote is not just from separate paragraphs of the paper, but from separate sections. The first half is from the abstract, and the second half is from the introduction. Always check creationist quotes, because 9 out of 10 times they are deceptive. So the full context from the introduction is, one way in which researchers have implicated a role of natural selection in driving phenotypic change is to show repeated evolution of a trait in similar environments. Such correlations, when controlled for phylogenetic relatedness, can provide evidence for selection rather than the stochastic process driving the evolution of a trait of interest. The paper is literally reporting on evidence for natural selection and finding that the null hypothesis of genetic drift can be rejected in cases like this. Randy, on the other hand, is cherry-picking quotes to make it seem like the authors are finding evidence against natural selection, because that's his whole goal here. Randy is lying to you. He's lying to me. Most importantly, he's lying to all the people who would give him their hard-earned money so that he can spread scientific illiteracy during a time when there's already a crisis of people ignoring sound science to the detriment of not just themselves and not just their society, but the whole planet. What Randy is doing should disgust you. He is a repulsive excuse for a man who wouldn't know the 9th commandment if God himself came down and broke Randy's nose with a stone tablet with the commandments inscribed on them.
The two genetic genes they're talking about is the number of vertebrae increase and the length of the vertebrae increase, and they do this repeatedly over and over again.
That's subtly wrong, though. They did not find that there was a single gene for vertebral length and another for vertebral count. They just found that they were not the same gene or genes. There could be multiple genes for either. The actual genetic mechanisms for tail length were not discovered because the genomes of these mice was not examined with that purpose. Instead, only partial genomes were used with focus on the mitochondrial DNA for the purposes of doing a phylogenetic analysis to see if the longer tails in forest mice had developed once or more than once in deer mice. Now, we cannot say how many loci were involved, just that more than one was. And of course, when Randy implies that the same changes happen to forest mice separately, he is ignoring the fact that they do not happen to the same extent, meaning that they are unlikely to be the result of some underlying fully deterministic mechanism. Additionally, because we know that the traits involved in this study are genetic and heritable, we have to have a mechanism for induced mutation for Randy to be right. Not only has he failed to provide one, all experiments to test for such mutations have failed to support the idea that organisms induce mutations in response to novel environmental stimuli. He would need to provide some mechanism and then test it before he could say that any genetic adaptation even could be the result of his continuous environmental tracking idea.
What an admission that is, that they're not saying that it's the environment that's randomly causing this over a long period of time, but it's in the DNA.
Yeah, they're saying that because that's what evolution is. The environment doesn't cause specific mutations, neither do the organisms. The organisms have a background mutation rate of stochastic changes to their DNA, which can be increased or decreased by environmental factors such as ambient radiation and mutagenic chemicals, but can't be steered by the environment or the organism. The role of the environment is simply to act as a filter for what mutations are going to be eliminated or spread, and it's not the only factor in that either. Evolution is at its foundation a change in allele frequencies across generations. That means that it's in the DNA. That's the whole point. I fail to see how it could be an admission by biologists that evolution works the way the theory says it works. Ray clearly has absolutely no idea what he's talking about, and of course Randy isn't about to explain it to him.
I mean, they admit that it's already there, and yet it's pointless to be there unless the environment provoked it.
Yes, again, according to standard evolutionary theory, variation is not directly caused by the environment, and various pre-exist new selection pressures. We've known this since the 1940s, and it works against the idea of a pre-programmed engineered system of non-stochastic adaptation, whether the impetus for the non-stochastic change be extrinsic or intrinsic to the organism. Ray is just badly describing evolution and saying how crazy it is that scientists would accept these things that are yet more evidence for evolution, and then not realize that they should reject evolution. This would be like if I told Ray that I had decided to reject Christianity because it turns out that Jerusalem is a real place.
Right, if their theory is right, but if what God has done is right, well, we would expect God to give it a variety of abilities to continue to live and function and respond.
You know, he says that, but I don't think it's true. Let's remember that when creationism first started out, they held to species fixity. That was the actual prediction of creationism. This idea of allowing for speciation and adaptation to new environments isn't a prediction of creationism. It's an accommodation that was only reached after much complaint from creationists, and only after it became extremely obvious that a species fixity was not only false but also a problem for the Ark story. Creationism never predicts accurately in a way that could differentiate it from evolution. It makes predictions that turn out to be wrong, it makes predictions that are just the same as evolution, and it accommodates evidence that runs contrary to its predictions. That's because creationism is pseudoscience, and those who push it are not concerned with rigor, science, predictability, or anything to do with the truth. They are identitarians who want to keep their us versus them mentality going as strongly as possible. often at the expense of society as a whole. Creationism is an intellectual plague that has dire consequences that go far beyond some people being wrong about the origin of biodiversity and the age of the earth.
Exactly, because the Bible tells us right at the beginning that he commanded creatures to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth.
He did, but isn't it odd how it wasn't until well into the 20th century that any creationist thought that it was not compatible with species fixity?
What a wonderful insight that is. That means these mice can fill prairie environments, they can fill forest environments, and I don't know exactly what the longer tail does for them.
What the He doesn't know what the longer tail does for them? Is he kidding me right now? If he read the paper, he'd find that it helps them with climbing, and since it's not prehensile, the only real option is balance. See, here's the thing. If you had asked me why forest mice had long tails before I read this paper, I'd say I didn't know. But after reading this paper, now I do. It's for climbing. I'm less confident about the mechanism, but I'm still pretty confident about it. How could Randy have read this paper and not know that? The only conclusion I can read is that he just didn't read it. He saw some keywords that caught his eye and has been citing this paper for years, all without ever actually reading the damn thing. This is academic, although not criminal, fraud. The absolute bare minimum that you need to do to cite a paper is to ensure that you read and understood it. This way you don't cite it to provide evidence of things it doesn't say. Randy is not only doing that, but by saying this, we know he didn't even read the paper. He doesn't know what's in the paper. Every time I respond to a creationist, I go in assuming good faith on their part. It is so rare that that assumption is ever shown to be true. You gotta lie to Yek.
But it serves a purpose, and they're able to do that.
Yeah, climbing, like it says in the paper Randy is citing. You know, the thing he's talking about right now. The thing he cut up like a dead pig to serve up in slices on this show.
I'd like to close with just 2 more quick examples.
2 more would make a total of 2 if they actually support his ideas.
These are dealing with lizards.
At least it's fellow reptiles this time. I like reptiles.
And this was an interesting case down in Brazil. There was a river and they put a dam in it and it made a lake and rapidly flooded the area and creating all these little separate islands. And before they had the islands, there were living in that area some large lizards and some small lizards.
This paper is about Gymnodactylus amarali, a species of gecko endemic to Brazil. I can't seem to find a common name for them in English. Basically, a valley was flooded for a hydroelectric dam, and 5 spots that had previously been the peaks of mountains became islands. Several species of termite-eating lizard that had existed on those mountains went extinct as they apparently had trouble eating enough. But the smaller G. amarali did not go extinct, and so was now alone on each island with a new food source that was going unexploited in the form of larger-bodied insects. As a result, all the island populations evolved larger heads to better exploit the new food source.
And the large lizards were able to eat the termites. And the small lizards could never get termites to eat.
Specifically, 5 lizard species larger than G. amarali, all of which fed on termites, as does G. amarali, and all of which were bigger than it, and all of which went extinct, at least on the islands, not the mainland.
But interestingly, after they made the dam and flooded this, creating these separate populations, the large lizards went extinct.
Nope, and it's just that G. amarali specialized in smaller termites, and the larger lizards ate larger termites. That's in the paper Randy is citing, meaning he should have read it. Evidently, once again, he's just a fraud.
And suddenly the small lizards could eat the termites.
Yep, presumably in these new, very small and fragmented habitats, they had trouble getting enough food.
But they're large. And interestingly, on all of the islands, the head of the small lizards got bigger so that it could eat the termites. And it did it predictably on all of the islands there.
Again, no, they were always eating termites. They just now had available to them larger termites, but those were at first too big to be eaten.
And in fact, this little graph on the left shows head length to body length for 2 different populations, mainland populations and island populations.
Yes, but significantly, on 2 of the islands closest to the mainland, which were the ones that separated last, the heads are actually intermediate as predicted by evolution, because of the integration of nearby mainland lizards into the gene pool of the island lizards more recently.
And these folks said that this provided, quote, strong evidence that the traits can change what? Predictably and precisely in ecological communities, and illustrates that populations can respond both rapidly and in parallel to ecological changes.
Oh, hey, look at that. 2 of the island populations are intermediate. That's kind of the thing you'd know if you read the paper. Something Randy doesn't seem to have done.
And I mentioned to you earlier that the literature is saying that adaptation is being characterized as highly regulated and...
Yes, but the paper uses natural selection to make the predictions that in the paper are then confirmed. What mechanism is Randy using? None. He doesn't have one. Yet again, we have a paper that the authors present as supporting natural selection, but Randy is using as evidence against it, without justification.
Rapid and repeatable and predictable, and this is exactly what we're seeing.
You know, he did say that, but he also has yet to give an example of a paper using the phrase highly regulated to characterize adaptation.
And that's a really good point, and we haven't really expanded on that, but
it's only what we're seeing in cases where separate but extremely closely related populations are entering very similar but geographically distinct environments. There's no evidence we can generalize this to all organisms, nor has Randy actually provided a mechanism that would account for this. The only mechanisms he has actually mentioned do not affect the genome, and so are insufficient to account for his examples.
When you think of the possibilities, let's just assume that the evolutionists are right for a moment.
It's not even a point at all, never mind a good one.
That things just change randomly.
You mean let's assume the thing that all of Randy's papers conclude? Okay, sure, let's do that.
Just according to mutation and time and what works and what doesn't work.
Nope, that's a straw man of evolution. Mutations are random, drift is random, but selection is not random. But what works and what doesn't isn't random, so evolution cannot be simply characterized as random.
Why would it always be that the lizard's head gets bigger? Why not have its stomach evolved so that it could eat plants?
Because the animal is already adapted to eat insects, and eating slightly bigger insects requires fewer changes than switching to an herbivorous diet. And so, since head size already varies anyway, that variant is already around to be selected for. Maybe in the long run there will be a switch to herbivory in these lizards, but the islands have only been islands since the 1990s. That's a pretty short time to entirely switch an organism's trophic apparatus from adapted to termites to adapted to fruits and leaves.
Or, a million other things. And yet every time it's always the head gets bigger. And that's, when you think about it, that is such a specific sort of thing that it would do it again and again and again if it was random.
Right, but it's not random.
Maybe the lizard gets wings and it can fly and eat butterflies now.
This guy clearly thinks evolution is just saltationism, where a crocodile could lay an egg that hatches into a bird. Evolution is something that happens with only minor changes over the generations. Evolving wings is a huge change, and these lizards already have highly specialized limbs for climbing, which is already a great survival mechanism for them. The idea that they would evolve wings in the course of fewer than 30 years is absolutely insane. But if it happened, it would actually be pretty good evidence that something other than evolution was going on. So we have yet another example of a creationist requesting as evidence for evolution something that, if seen, would actually falsify evolution.
Randomness would allow for all sorts of things to enable that creature to survive.
No, it doesn't, because any given mutation will only have a small effect on the morphology of the organism carrying it, and we've only had a bit more than 2 decades of time for change in these lizards. Only relatively small changes could have happened in that time, and further, evolution tends to follow the path of least resistance. If a lizard can do better by having a bigger head, that's more likely to be the immediate change than getting a flying lizard. How would flying even help?
But genetics would say its head's going to get bigger.
I don't know what he means by that.
And we can predict it, and it happens every time.
That's exactly right, and it's very specific to the need.
And was predicted in that paper in some detail by using evolutionary biology based on natural selection, meaning that this whole thing is at best neither evidence for or against continuous environmental tracking. This is yet another example that does nothing to show the inadequacy of natural selection. Indeed, provides support for it, since it was used to make predictions about the lizards that ended up being true.
And then finally, just close with one other lizard. What we're looking at is a man named Jonathan Losos. He's probably the world's leading researcher on these common lizards that we see everywhere. They're called Anolis lizards.
I do like those.
And he's researching in the Caribbean. And he researches all over islands, and he found that on islands with large trees, the lizards have long legs, and on islands with like scrub brush, they have short legs.
Okay, so just the exact same thing except with legs instead of mouths. Great.
Well, a natural experiment happened. A hurricane came through and killed all of the lizards on 7 islands. And they all had scrub brush vegetation. So he did an interesting experiment. He went to islands that had trees, and he took lizards with long legs, and he repopulated the islands with the scrub brush vegetation.
That seems ethically dubious, but based on what I know of evolution and embryology and how easily something like limb length can vary, I'm going to guess that in short order the lizards evolved shorter limbs.
And this is what he says. Our prediction, well, there again, they shouldn't be able to predict anything. It should be random.
Then how did they predict it, Randy? How did I? The fact that they're doing things Randy doesn't think they should be able to do should give him a clue that maybe he doesn't understand evolution, and his version of it that he's arguing against is a straw man. The fact is they do make this prediction, and Randy needs to deal with that, figure out how they did it, and why. Maybe if he did that, he would realize that most of his ideas about continuous environmental tracking are meaningless, and he'd at least have the possibility of creating a new idea that has some mechanism and makes novel predictions, instead of a gigantic pile of nothing like he has now.
Our prediction was that they would evolve, how about adapt?
Well, since adaptation is part of evolution, I'm fine with either word here.
Shorter legs. Look, and they did, over the course of 4 million years.
It's so disingenuous to make fun of evolution when its predictions come true. Here's a scientist working in a well-established theoretical framework who is making accurate predictions, and then all Randy can do is pretend that because this change didn't take as long to occur as, say, the change from a flightless dinosaur to a bird, that therefore the successful predictions just don't count and are laughable.
No. Over the course of 4 years, average limb length steadily declined on all 7 islands, exactly as predicted.
And note, as predicted by evolution via natural selection. Randy may not like that that's the prediction natural selection makes, but it is. Any point he tries to make based on the premise that natural selection predicts something else is flatly wrong, and he knows it, because he read what the prediction of natural selection was off of his own slide.
All 7 islands were evolving. How about all 7 islands, the organisms were self-adjusting in lockstep with specific changes to the specific conditions?
How about no, because evidence of a confirmed prediction of evolution by natural selection isn't reason to suggest a new, undefined, and so far unevidenced mechanism for adaptation.
How blind do you have to be to not see that the creature has this ability and it's going to do it every time? Because if it was random, again, maybe it turns into a snake and slithers, or...
You mean like glass snakes? A group of lizards that evolved a slithering limbless condition independently of true snakes? How about that? The very thing he asked for is something we also have. But also note how he's asking for something that in this case was specifically not predicted, while just glossing over the fact that what happened was exactly what was expected if evolution via natural selection were true.
Or does something else. So many possibilities.
Not really. Leg length already varies in anoles, and when finding themselves in a place where the shortest legs are more fit, you'll find a decrease in average limb length over time as the longer-limbed lizards have a harder time reproducing as much as the shorter-limbed lizards. That's 100% in line with evolutionary expectations, as evidenced by the fact that when a biologist applied evolutionary theory to these lizards, that was the exact prediction he made.
And yet it's always the shorter leg? Come on.
I know.
Yeah, how silly of scientists to take confirmed predictions of evolutionary biology as evidence of the validity of evolutionary biology.
It's exactly there. So what we're really looking at in so many ways is a type of engineered adaptability where these organisms are able to continuously track environmental changes with responses that can be predictable and precise to solve problems.
You know, theistic evolution would also allow for that, and it's not contradicted by basically all the evidence that we have. Nor does it require people to just ignore the successful predictions of evolutionary biology. But oh well, that's all Randy has. After that, Randy just has his metaphorical member sucked by Rove for a few more sentences, and then the show is over. It's hard for me to comprehend just how void of any substance continuous environmental tracking is. I really want to be able to investigate it, to come up with ways to test its mechanisms, see what predictions it can make. But I can't. There are no mechanisms. There are no novel predictions. It's just a bunch of vagueness tossed around in a way that will make a certain kind of theist feel warm fuzzies in their heart. Also, of course, it comes with just blatant lies about science, as is expected. Oh well, I guess that's where we are with this attempt at an idea. It's just nothing. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and tell me what you liked in the comments. If you didn't like it, then hit dislike and let me know what the problem was. Either way, please subscribe if you haven't, and turn on all notifications so that occasionally YouTube might tell you about my content, if they feel like it, regardless of your wishes. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Ben Tovand, Phil Ravara, Tapioca Weasel, Whispers, John Ackerman, Strawberry Vein, Dr. Tapioca Weasel, Elaround Teller, Horseflesh, Ian Chen, Kelvin Brostick Van Manen, Landon Knoll, Mabdy Babbity, Sphincter of Doom, and Ballas. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 10% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos, often 3 to 5 months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.